the early hours of March 18, 1993, the village of Dunmire was fast asleep beneath a low canopy of coastal mist. The fog clung to the gabled rooftops and old elm trees, swallowing sound and streetlight alike. Nothing stirred on the cobbled lanes but the soft tapping of ivy against shuttered windows. And then it rang. 12 slow tolls from the bell tower of St. Ethel's Convent. High on the hill overlooking the village. Midnight. Nothing unusual. Except the bell hadn't worked in years. It had been declared structurally unsound. The rope mechanism, long since removed after a lightning strike, cracked the tower's interior. Stone in 1985. Yet it rang, loudly, echoing through the valley, like a call from somewhere deep, underground. The villagers stirred. Curtains shifted. Lights flickered on in scattered windows, and among them was Constable William Fraser, who, from the steps of his small cottage, stared up at the silhouette of the convent, barely visible through the fog. The bell had stopped, but something hung in the air, some tension that made him step inside, pick up the phone and call it in. Before we continue, if you're already drawn into this mystery, if that bell tolls somewhere in your memory now, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. The story of St. Ethel's crosses borders and beliefs. It demands to be heard. By dawn, Fraser and 2 officers from the county station arrived at the convent's iron gate. The outer grounds were silent. No movement in the vegetable garden. No figures walking the gravel paths. The gate was ajar. The convent's front doors were unlocked. Strange, but not impossible. St. Ethel's was a cloistered order after all. Few came and went. Inside, the corridors smelled faintly of beeswax and damp wool. Candles had melted into puddles on their holders. The crucifix in the entry hall hung slightly askew, and there, on the tiled floor of the nave, lay a tray of untouched communion wafers, as if dropped in sudden haste. 12 rooms were searched, 12 beds unmade, 12 sets of shoes left by door frames. In the kitchen, a kettle still sat on the burner, cold now, but full. The clock above the hearth had stopped at 12 exactly. All 12 women, Mother Superior Agnes, Sisters Miriam, Claire, Isolde, Thérèse, Joan, Marguerite, Winifred, Eileen, Benedicta, Ruth, and Judith had vanished without a trace. Not a single footprint leading away from the building. No signs of struggle. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry. Even the convent dogs, a pair of elderly sheepdogs often seen on the grounds, were never found. The media caught hold of it within 48 hours. The silent convent ran one headline. Vanished virgins read another, more sensational. But the locals weren't surprised. Not exactly. St. Ethel's had always been different. Built in 1861 atop what once had been a pagan well site, the convent had a complicated history with the village of Dunmire. The nuns, members of the enclosed order of the vow perpetual, rarely mingled. Their chants echoed faintly across the valley every evening, and their presence was felt, if not seen. There were stories, passed down, hushed, altered with each retelling, of the place, being built on sacred ground older than Christianity, of a sickness that struck the first builders, of a child buried in the cornerstone. But no one expected this. Over the following week, the convent was swarmed by police, journalists, and even ecclesiastical investigators from the diocese. The grounds were combed with ground-penetrating radar. The well beneath the garden, dry since 1912, was dredged. Every journal, hymn book, and library tome was catalogued. Nothing explained the disappearance. And yet, there was one detail that was consistently noted by the first officers inside. On the altar in the main chapel, beneath the large crucifix flanked by faded wall frescoes, someone had placed 12 veils, folded, pressed, and arranged in a perfect semicircle, one for each nun. No name tags, no signs of damage, but each one, upon closer inspection, held a single gray hair threaded through its lace. The question that haunted investigators wasn't only where the nuns had gone. It was, why would 12 women of faith voluntarily remove the one item symbolizing their vows? The incident drew attention from the highest levels of the church. The Vatican issued a brief, careful statement. A matter of internal investigation, it read. Rumors swirled of a team from Rome arriving quietly at night, staying 2 days, and leaving with 3 boxes of documents no one saw cataloged. Publicly, the investigation was eventually suspended due to lack of evidence. The official theory: mass disappearance under unknown circumstances. Possibly voluntary, but those in Dunmire never believed it. Voluntary? Not Sister Miriam, who cared for the sick in the village and once wept when her favorite cat died. Not stern Sister Therese, who rarely spoke but was known to kneel in the chapel for hours after nightfall. These were women whose lives were built around ritual, devotion, and silence, not flight. And then there was the final report written by Constable Fraser, 2 weeks after the event, filed just before he took indefinite leave and moved from the region entirely. "I don't know what I heard," he wrote, "but I swear to God, after the bell rang and before we reached the convent, I thought I heard singing, very faint, carried down the hill. But it was backwards, like a hymn played in reverse, and underneath it something else, a grinding like stone. The bell never rang again. The tower was sealed, but every year on the anniversary of the disappearance, locals say the mist falls heavier, faster, and sometimes if you stand at the base of the hill and close your eyes, you can hear the faint sound of lace catching on stone, and the quiet breath of voices that shouldn't be there." By the 3rd week of the investigation, the search had turned inward, beneath the convent's stone foundations, into its shadows, its silences. The upper rooms had yielded no evidence, beyond the eerily preserved personal effects of the missing nuns. Toothbrushes, folded nightgowns, handwritten prayers by bedside tables. Everything intact, everything undisturbed. And so attention turned to the undercroft, the sealed passage beneath the chapel floor. St. Ethel's had no basement in the traditional sense, but parish records from 1892 mentioned a substructure, a crypt or storage area beneath the main chapel, rarely used and rumored to have been sealed after a small fire in the early 1900s. The structure's plans were vague, the original blueprints lost in a parish fire during the Blitz, but the floor of the chapel bore something unmistakable, a set of worn stone slabs, circular in formation, distinct from the surrounding floor, like a great, flattened millstone sealed with pitch and ash. It was Constable Fraser who first noticed the carvings. In his logbook, he noted that the edges of the circle bore markings unlike the traditional crosses or Latin phrases common in ecclesiastical architecture. Instead, there were curling, looping lines, spirals, branching thorns, and a shape that some later compared to a triskel, others to a coiled serpent. Not overtly pagan, but not recognizably Christian either, and it wasn't just one set of markings. On closer inspection, the designs seemed layered. Centuries of etchings, some faded almost to invisibility, others sharp and recent, as if hands over generations had added to them, copied them, fed them. The local diocese resisted efforts to unseal the floor, but after mounting pressure from investigators and media, a team of forensic archaeologists was granted permission to enter with ground scanning tools and thermal imaging. What they discovered beneath the stone stunned them. A chamber, roughly circular, hollow, at least 20 feet below the surface. But what made it unusual wasn't its existence, it was what it wasn't. There were no stairs leading down, no entry point from any side. It was as if the chamber had been carved in isolation, like a bubble trapped within solid rock. One of the archaeologists later described it this way in a private interview: "It wasn't a crypt. It wasn't meant to hold the dead. It was more like a throat, something meant to be closed, sealed, suppressed. Accessing it required heavy equipment, something the church was unwilling to allow. And yet, one night in April, under the cover of darkness and without diocesan approval, a separate team, unknown even to local law enforcement, arrived and began excavation. The chapel was cordoned off. No media allowed. 3 days later, they left. No official record remains of what they found, but afterward, the chapel was declared structurally unsound and permanently closed. Only one person, Father Dennis Coombs, an aging priest once assigned to Dunmire in the 1970s, spoke about the undercroft in public. "I remember," he said in a BBC radio interview years later, "that Mother Agnes once told me the chapel was built on a site older than memory, that the altar was set like a plug, her word, not mine, and that should it ever be removed, something would awaken. I thought she was being poetic, or mad." He laughed. But not long, not sincerely. Documented fact. Parish records from 1879 detail a monk named Brother Anselm who attempted to map the subterranean layout of St. Ethel's. His final entry reads, "There is a room beneath the altar, round, black. The air inside does not breathe." Bizarre detail. One of the archaeologists, Dr. Lena Mulgrave, resigned from the project days after the private dig and refused to speak publicly. She moved to the Outer Hebrides and later became a recluse, known for burning candles in her windows at all hours. Locals claimed she once said some walls should never be tapped. Unresolved question. Why did the nuns not report the strange carvings? Surely they saw them. Surely they prayed over them daily. Were they protecting something? Or binding it? There were whispers among the locals of an old prayer, one not taught in any seminary or catechism, that was recited at dusk by the nuns. It wasn't Latin, it wasn't English. It was a chant, low and rhythmic, almost insect-like in cadence. Several residents said they heard it echo from the chapel just before sunset, always finishing with the sound of 3 knocks, slow, deliberate from somewhere inside the stone. Recordings of the chant, if any existed, were never released. The church denies any knowledge of it. And then there was the child. In 1990, 3 years before the disappearance, a young girl, 10-year-old Sophie Wren, went missing near the convent grounds. She had been picking wildflowers with her mother near the perimeter wall. A blink, a moment of distraction, and she was gone. A massive search ensued. Dogs, helicopters, no trace. But a month later, Sophie returned. She was found sitting calmly on the chapel steps at dawn, barefoot, wrapped in a nun's shawl. She could not speak. Not at first. When she did, she only said one thing, over and over. The women with eyes of salt. The women with eyes of salt. Sophie was placed in long-term psychiatric care. Her file remained sealed, but her story resurfaced in whispers after the 12. Nuns vanished because the shawl she wore the morning she returned was identified by Sister Miriam's cousin. It bore her initials, embroidered in tiny white thread. Salt was found caked along the hem. Investigators returned to the chapel again and again, searching for loose stones, hidden panels, evidence of ancient wells or tunnels. Nothing. The stone floor remained still, silent, cold, but every photograph taken of the chapel interior during that time, without exception, displayed faint blurring around the altar, as if the lens could not fully resolve its edges, as if light refused to hold shape there. And in one photo, filed and later quietly removed from public archives, something else could be seen, just behind the altar, a faint impression on the wall, like the outline of a hand, but not human-sized, much larger. The security system at St. Ethel's was minimal, but functional by convent standards. A single black and white CCTV camera, mounted high in the corner of the vestibule, captured the comings and goings at the main entrance. The device recorded in 12-hour loops to a series of VHS tapes kept in the office, adjacent to the front door. Most of the tapes, over the course of years, had captured little more than deliveries, a rare bishop's visit, or the occasional wandering traveler asking for directions to the coast. But on reviewing the tape from March 15, 1993, 3 days before the disappearance, investigators noted a disruption in the usual rhythm of stillness. At 3:14 p.m., the camera recorded the front door swinging open. A figure entered, tall, male, clad in a long black cassock. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, casting a deep shadow across his face. His posture was straight, movements slow but certain, like someone walking a familiar path. He carried no luggage. The man approached the guest book at the entry desk. He paused, did not write, then turned and walked out of frame, deeper into the convent. He was never recorded leaving. The next 12 hours of footage, well into the next tape, showed no sign of him exiting, no cloaked figure, no departing visitor, no indication that the man had ever returned to the vestibule. Even stranger, the timestamp at the bottom of the footage showed subtle flickers after his entry, a kind of ghosting effect, frame, skips and jittering, as if the device itself strained to keep time. This anomaly was not present on the tapes before or after. Only that one segment. The man was never identified. Local parish records showed no visiting clergy assigned to St. Ethel's during that week. The bishopric denied sending any investigator, monk, or visiting friar to the convent. No neighboring orders recognized the description, and no nearby guest houses recorded anyone of that appearance staying during the period in question. The man had, in official terms, appeared from nowhere and vanished into nothing. Documented fact. The visitor's arrival was precisely 3 years to the day after. Sophie Wren returned to the chapel steps. March 15, 1990. The girl who whispered of women with eyes of salt. Bizarre detail. A closer analysis of the CCTV footage, done years later with enhanced resolution, revealed that the shadow beneath the visitor's hat was so deep, no facial features could be discerned, not even a reflection in the vestibule's window, where all other figures had cast some trace. His shadow, too, curved strangely, as if the light could not land properly around him. Unresolved question. If he never left through the main doors, where did he go? Did the nuns hide him? Or did he descend into that sealed chamber, that hollow throat beneath the chapel? Dr. Helen Murnane would later note, in her private field journal, there are visitors who bring flowers, visitors who bring questions, and then there are those who bring nothing, but take something with them when they go. And still, official records listed no break-in, no signs of intrusion, and no nuns reported having met a visitor during that time. But there was one account, buried in the footnotes of a declassified internal church report that surfaced decades later. It came from Sister Joan's confessor, Father Alan Prescott, who had not visited St. Ethel's in the months leading up to the incident, but received a letter from her, postmarked March 16th. In it she wrote, "We were visited, not by someone sent, not by someone known, but by someone who watches. I do not believe he wears the cross for the same reasons we do." He spoke no words, but his presence felt remembered, as though we had seen him before, but in dream. That letter was never publicly acknowledged by the church. After the convent's closure, the security tapes were stored in the diocesan archives, all but one. The tape from March 15th, where the visitor first appears, was reported missing in 1997 during a routine cataloging. Only a low-resolution duplicate remains, kept by the original lead investigator, Sergeant Lorna Dempsey, who later left the force and pursued a degree in folklore and mysticism at the University of Exeter. She refused to comment on her reasons for changing careers. But in one lecture, caught on tape, she stated, "Some myths begin in truth. Others are attempts to explain holes left in the fabric of history. The figure on that tape? He isn't a myth. He's a reminder that absence is sometimes an act of design." Villagers began to speculate that the man had come not as an intruder, but as an emissary, from where no one could say. Some described him as a watcher, a term lifted from the apocryphal Book of Enoch, which speaks of ancient beings who observe humanity and intervene only in dire moments. Others believed he was no man at all, but a relic of an older order, something buried by the church, forgotten by time and reawakened by presence. Curiously, after the footage aired, once during a late-night BBC documentary in 2002, reports surfaced from viewers across Europe claiming to have seen the same figure. One caller from Slovenia said, "I've seen him near the edge of my mother's church. He was standing still beneath the linden tree. I thought he was a statue. Then he turned." Another wrote, "My grandmother said he visited her once in 1956, told her to sing a hymn backwards in light 3, candles upside down." Of course, such claims were dismissed as hysteria, the power of suggestion magnified by late-night airwaves. Yet the descriptions remained eerily consistent. Black cassock, wide-brimmed hat, a face shrouded in unnatural shadow, and always the same final note. He didn't walk, one woman recalled. He floated, just slightly, as if his feet weren't sure the earth still wanted them. The convent's vestibule, where the camera once sat, is now stripped bare. The desk is gone, the guest book missing, but a faint ring remains on the floor, where the man stood. Not a scuff, not a mark of shoes, a perfect circle, as if the stone had darkened where he lingered, as if the building remembered him. When Detective Inspector Meredith Claymore stepped into the choir room of St. Ethel's, she paused, not for breath, but for something more instinctive. A feeling that the space wasn't empty, even if it appeared to be. It was the kind of room that resisted intrusion, as if it had been holding its breath for too long and might exhale at any moment. Dust hung in thick beams of light filtering through arched windows. Pews pushed neatly to the sides bore the thin outlines of where cassocks had once rested. Every chair was accounted for. Nothing out of place, and yet the atmosphere was wrong. Not from disorder, but from stillness. Stillness too absolute. She ran her fingers along the edge of the choir's psalm cabinet. All 73 hymnals were present, alphabetically ordered, none missing or marked. A strange sort of precision, considering 12 women had vanished overnight. One would expect haste, disruption, but not here. Not in this room. On the southern wall hung a single-framed icon, Saint Cecilia, patron saint of music, depicted with eyes closed and hands folded in prayer. But it wasn't the painting that unsettled Claymore. It was what lay beneath it. A long, faint scratch etched into the stone wall, horizontal, deliberate, almost like a tally mark, fresh. The frame had been shifted slightly to conceal it. When forensics examined the scratch under UV light, they found it was not a simple gouge. Microscopic residues of iron, sulfur, and salt were embedded in the stone, as if the mark had been made with something not entirely natural. One analyst remarked, half joking, if someone took a claw to it, it wasn't from any creature known to science. And the silence in the choir room wasn't just metaphorical. During testing, sound technicians noticed that recording devices captured an unusual dampening effect within the space. Whispers became garbled. Notes struck on a tuning fork decayed rapidly. Even footsteps dulled. The room swallowed sound, not evenly but rhythmically. Like breath. Like listening. Documented fact. St. Ethel's choir room was known in the 1950s for its unique acoustics. Several Gregorian chant recordings from the Dunmire Liturgical Society were made there. The recordings gained a brief cult following for their haunting tone. Audio experts later identified unexplained harmonic undertones beneath the chant's low, pulsing frequencies, unaccounted for by the singers, range or recording equipment. Bizarre detail. One of the recordings, Psalm 139, "If I ascend into heaven, you are there," contains a moment, at timestamp 203, where a second, discordant voice is heard joining in. The voice is deeper than the rest, inhumanly so, and speaks a word not found in any known liturgical language. Scholars have debated for decades whether it's a studio artifact or something else. The word phonetically transcribed is Eshonai. Unresolved question. What did the nuns sing in those final days? What hymn could they have used that left behind not an echo, but a vacuum? Villagers recall hearing the choir practicing at dusk, as always. But in the week before the disappearance, the music changed. Agnes Frew, who ran the post office at the edge of town, said she walked her dog past the convent the night before the nuns vanished. The air was still, the windows lit with candlelight. And then she heard it. Music, yes, but not like before. It wasn't a song, she recalled in a 1994 interview. It was like moaning, rhythmic, slow. It didn't rise. It dug, like it was pulling something up from under the earth. Others heard it too. A group of teenagers, breaking curfew, sneaking along the convent's stone wall, said they felt their teeth vibrate. When the sound reached a certain pitch, one of them, Thomas Bexley, developed tinnitus shortly after and swore he continued to hear faint chanting in the days that followed. The final notation in the convent's choir ledger, written in Sister Edith's meticulous handwriting, simply reads, March 17th, the calling tone, key unknown. Repeat until veil lifts. It was the only entry in the book that diverged from standard practice. No page number, no hymn title, just that one cryptic phrase. The ledger was later taken as evidence and stored at the National Archives. But a photocopy was made by a junior officer. On the margins of that copy, someone had scribbled in pencil, "They weren't singing to God." And then there's the organ, a rare 1901 Reed Harrison Chapel model, maintained dutifully over the years by Sister Clare. It stood silent on the west wall of the choir room, untouched in the days following the investigation until a Technician attempted to test it for damage. When he pressed the lowest C key, the room's temperature dropped 4 degrees in under a second. Then, without further provocation, the organ produced a second tone, higher, dissonant, all on its own. The technician recorded the anomaly on a DAT tape. He refused to play it back. According to his testimony, once was enough. It didn't sound like music. It sounded like something asking why. From that point on, no one dared play the organ again. But one night, months after the investigation ceased and the convent was shuttered, a security guard doing rounds reported hearing it, just once. A long, slow chord, like breath being held. The next morning, when the head groundskeeper entered to investigate, he found the choir room exactly as before, dust on every surface. No footprints, no signs of intrusion, except the icon of St. Cecilia had fallen from the wall, and carved beneath where it hung, below the original scratch, was a new mark. Deeper this time, more jagged, like something had answered. They called her the anchor behind the stone walls of St. Ethel's, Sister Joan, the convent's mother superior, revered not only for her deep piety, but for her precise rituals. Her days were ruled by liturgical order, the candle-lit vigils, the strict Benedictine hours, the silence after Compline. She was a woman whose handwriting betrayed the rigidity of her soul. Angular, exact, almost mechanical. When the police first entered her chambers, they found the space untouched. A small iron bed, blanket neatly folded at its foot, a nightstand bearing a tin of sacramental wafers and a half-burned candle. A single glass of water, untouched, sat by the window. But it was the desk that drew their attention. A thin, leather-bound journal lay open beneath a cracked lamp. It was positioned as if someone had just stepped away mid-entry. The left page was filled with Sister Joan's familiar script, dated March 17, 1993, the night before the disappearance. But the right-hand page was blank. When forensics returned the next morning to catalog her belongings, something had changed. The written page was now empty. Every word that had filled it just 12 hours before had vanished, without smudge, scratch, or tear. The ink itself was gone, not faded, not bled, erased. Yet under UV light, faint impressions remained, not of handwriting, but of symbols, geometric, repeating, like latticework or a primitive calendar. Sister Joan had not written a prayer that night. She had inscribed something else, something measured. Documented fact. Sister Joan had studied briefly at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome before her assignment to St. Ethel's. During that time, she developed an interest in numerology and early Christian apocrypha, particularly the Sibylline, oracles, texts believed by some to contain coded timelines for divine interventions. Bizarre detail. Pages torn from an earlier section of the journal were later recovered, burned and stuffed behind a loose board in the chapel crypt. The fragments bore fragmented Latin invocations, but one English line was still legible. The circle will narrow. The veil will thrum. We are not alone in the wine dark hour. Unresolved question. What did Sister Joan discover, or believe she discovered, that compelled her to erase her own thoughts? And if she didn't erase them herself, who or what did? Father Alan Prescott, the same priest who received her unsettling letter days earlier, claimed in a closed-door interview that Sister Joan had mentioned dreams not her own, visions of mechanical stars, bleeding trees, and a child with no mouth, silent but humming. She had become obsessed with the idea that time within St. Ethel's was misaligned, that the convent stood at a fixed point, while hours flowed around it, faster and slower depending on prayer and ritual. She once told him cryptically, "We are not counting the hours. We are holding them." Other nuns noticed her changes too. Sister Imelda, the youngest in the order, wrote in her diary, recovered intact. Mother Joan locks herself in the chapel now after midnight. She sings without words. The notes feel like numbers. I dreamed of falling upwards. When investigators brought the journal to experts in manuscript preservation, they found faint traces of gallatanic acid, an ink component known for its longevity. But the page's fibers showed no sign of chemical reaction. It was as though the ink had been absorbed, drunk by the page itself. Or by something else. The strange geometric impressions, when rendered in 3D by digital technicians, revealed a rough spiral, like the Fibonacci sequence but irregular, tapering toward a center point marked by what appeared to be an eye. Some saw only symbols. Others, once shown the rendering, reported headaches, vertigo, even auditory hallucinations. One intern at the university's theology department said he heard faint singing when looking at the image too long. He fainted in the lab. When he came to, he said only, "She called something that can't go back." He never returned to the project. In an interview years later, Dr. Helen Murnane revisited Sister Joan's journal in her lecture, Veils and Thresholds, Liminal Spaces in Monastic Rituals. She said it was not prophecy. It was a mechanism, a ritual architecture. I believe Sister Joan designed a liturgical clock, a psalmic countdown, synchronized with something beneath the convent, a place where time thins. The journal's last physical page bore a single indentation, a circle, drawn with pressure, centered perfectly in the middle. It matched the strange ring left on the vestibule floor where the unknown visitor had stood. And then came the truly impossible detail. In 1998, the journal was briefly housed in a sealed archive, boxed during a transfer from diocesan storage to the British Museum's Rare Text Division. When archivists reopened it, they discovered something that wasn't there before. On the once blank page, faint ink had returned. But it wasn't in Sister Joan's handwriting. Instead, it bore a single sentence, printed in block script unlike anything else in the book. The door is a circle and the lock is a song. No one could explain how the ink reappeared. There were no signs of tampering, no fingerprints, and the box had remained sealed in climate-controlled containment. The block script has never been matched to any of the nuns or staff, but the phrasing echoed an earlier line from Sister Edith's choir ledger. Repeat until the veil lifts, and beneath it all another question fermented quietly. What door? There was no record of a sealed room beneath the convent. No access to catacombs, no architectural blueprints suggesting hidden spaces. But if there was a door, who opened it? And what, if anything, answered? The cellar beneath St. Ethel's was never part of any official tour, not even for visiting clergy. It wasn't picturesque like the chapel or warm like the kitchen. It was utilitarian. Stone walls, an uneven flagstone floor, and a ceiling low enough to stoop. It had once stored root vegetables and wine, later canned goods, but after the 1972 storm flooded it waist-high. The nuns had largely abandoned it, and yet someone had returned to it before the night of the vanishing. Detective Claymore descended the narrow stairwell on a hunch. The wood underfoot moaned like a warning, the kind of sound you feel more in your ribs than your ears. The air grew heavier, a stale weight pressing against her lungs. She had visited war bunkers that felt less entombed. Her flashlight beam swept across a few rusted shelves, cracked jars, some collapsed crates, and then paused. In the far corner of the room, in a patch of untouched dust, lay something no one expected, a pattern. Not footprints, not tool marks, a design, carefully etched into the dust. Spanning nearly the entire floor was an intricate series of concentric rings, lines, and dots, like a map or a mechanism, or both. It was delicate, drawn not with fingers, but with a fine implement, as if the person who created it was terrified of smudging the message. The outermost ring bore evenly spaced marks, 12 in total, each ending in a small, stylized cross. Documented fact. Aerial photos taken of the convent grounds in the 1960s show 12 small stone markers along the southern slope. Now overgrown, parish records list them as stations, but their purpose is unclear. No records of processions or rituals at those locations exist. Claymore called in a specialist from the British Museum. Dr. Linnea North, a medieval symbologist, examined the dust map in silence for nearly 20 minutes. Finally, she said, "This isn't a drawing. It's a liturgy in spatial form. It's a way of walking a prayer." She believed the markings represented a ritual labyrinth, designed to be walked clockwise, with pauses at each of the 12 points. But it wasn't a meditative practice. The central ring held a shape she recognized, barely. "It's nearly identical," she said, to the centerpiece design in the Codex Obscura, a forbidden 14th century manuscript burned during the Council of Basel. Only fragments survive. That codex, according to scattered translations, outlined rituals for piercing the firmament between seen and unseen, specifically using sound. Bizarre detail. Among the crates in the cellar was a broken metronome, stripped of its pendulum, but otherwise intact. Taped to its side was a scrap of parchment, likely torn from a hymnal. On it, handwritten in red ink, "Beat is the blade. Repeat is the key. Unresolved question." What was the ritual's purpose? And had it been completed or interrupted? Investigators considered the possibility that Sister Joan, or perhaps a group within the convent, had devised a coordinated ceremony. Not traditional worship, not even heretical devotion. Something older, geometric, measured, a rite for something beneath time. The dust map was carefully photographed and preserved before the cellar was sealed. But in the photos, analysts found something even stranger. Across 4 of the 12 outer points, tiny scatterings of dark residue were visible. To the naked eye, they were just soot or mold. Under lab analysis, the residue contained trace elements of lanthanides, rare earth metals. One of the chemists asked offhand, who was burning old cathode tubes down there? But the convent had no such equipment, and the cellar had no power. There was another anomaly. In the center of the ritual pattern, the flagstone floor bore a single circular stain darker than the surrounding stone. It didn't fluoresce under UV. It didn't dissolve under standard solvents. It was not blood, not oil. And yet, it shimmered faintly, like shellac or resin. Claymore had it tested. The results returned inconclusive. The sample did not match any known organic or synthetic compound. It had no cellular structure, no DNA, no decay pattern. Dr. North reviewed the lab report and offered a single hushed comment. "It's as if something left a footprint, but not from our side." In the weeks following, villagers began to speak, softly, cautiously, about strange happenings in the days leading up to the disappearance. A farmhand named Peter Loring, who worked the southern field adjoining the convent's orchard, claimed he saw strange lights moving along the ground. Late at night, not above the treetops, along the soil. He described them as white fires with no smoke, tracing circles, vanishing when approached. He also mentioned hearing music, faint and rhythmic, that seemed to come from beneath the earth. But most chilling was the testimony of an elderly woman named Miriam Gallows, whose family had lived in Dunmire for generations. She came forward only once and only to Claymore. She said the dust map in the cellar resembled a forbidden carving she'd seen in a church in eastern France during the war, hidden under a loose stone behind the altar. A carving too ancient to be Christian, with symbols that made the priests nervous. The carving, she claimed, was older than the church. Before the bells, she said, before the crosses, and the phrase carved beneath it. Walk the wheel and hum the dark. Back at St. Ethel's, the cellar was resealed. Officially, due to structural instability. Unofficially, no one wanted to go back in. And weeks later, when Claymore reviewed the photographs of the dust map again, something caught her eye. She'd seen the symbol at the very center once before. It was carved into the underside of the fallen St. Cecilia icon in the choir room. Whatever had happened in that cellar had been choreographed. A long-planned rite, not for escape, not for summoning, but for exchange. For nearly 6 weeks after the vanishing, the investigation into St. Ethel's stalled. Statements contradicted each other. Evidence disintegrated. Doors that had once opened no longer budged. And clocks inside the convent, despite fresh batteries, refused to keep time. Then came the tape. It arrived in an unmarked envelope, postmarked from Cambridge, with no return address. Inside, a standard BASF cassette, the kind used for everyday recording in the 1980s. Its only label was a handwritten number 13. Detective Claymore played the tape in her office, expecting perhaps an old sermon or choir practice. Instead, the room filled with sound that did not belong to any known liturgical archive. It was music, yes, but fractured. At times beautiful, at times unbearable. It began with the opening chords of Ave Maris Stella, a Marian hymn traditionally sung at Vespers. The choir sounded tentative, as if sight reading, their voices slightly delayed, but it wasn't the hesitancy that chilled Claymore. It was the moment precisely 2 minutes in when the harmony split. A 13th voice joined. Documented fact. The choir at St. Ethel's was always 12 members strong, a practical and symbolic decision echoing the 12 apostles. Sister Edith, the convent's choirmaster, was meticulous about maintaining that number, even declining new novices until a position opened. On the tape, as the choir reached the second stanza, Monstrate su matre, a voice entered above the sopranos. Not louder, not sharper, just Other, a sound unlike the others, metallic, resonant, echoing not through the air, but inside the chest, like a vibration from within. It sang no words. Only a single note that rose in microtonal increments, never quite landing on any pitch familiar to Western music. Yet it remained perfectly synchronized with the hymn, as if it had always belonged there, until you listened closer. And then you realized the note never stopped. Even when the others paused for breath, that voice continued. Bizarre detail. A forensic audiologist brought in to analyze. The recording confirmed that the 13th note had no detectable inhale, no sign of a human diaphragm. When reversed, the waveform produced a pattern that, when translated into binary, rendered an image, a perfect spiral, almost identical to the one in Sister Joan's journal. Unresolved question: who or what produced that voice? And why was the tape mailed anonymously after the disappearance? Claymore traced the serial number on the cassette. It had been part of a bulk order delivered to St. Ethel's in 1992, used mostly for recording rehearsals and feast day services, but there was no record of a 13th tape being made. Choir logs stopped at number 12, and yet someone had labeled this one carefully. With intention. 13. Dr. Helen Murnane consulted once again, made a peculiar observation. In apocalyptic theology, the number 13 is not simply seen as unlucky. It marks the first number outside divine order. 12 is structure, the 12 tribes, the 12 apostles. 13 is the crack. She listened to the tape in full silence. When it ended, she asked to hear it again. Then a third time. She finally said, "It's a summoning, a tonal liturgy. The voice doesn't follow the hymn follows it." In a chilling echo of this insight, an entry from Sister Imelda's diary, one of the few surviving firsthand accounts, described a dream she had weeks before the disappearance. We sang in circles. I heard her above us. Not Mother Joan, someone else, older than the hymns. She does not need breath. When we stop, she keeps singing. She is trying to teach us her song. Another entry mentions strange acoustic behavior in the choir room. Echoes that came before the note was sung. Harmonies that shifted depending on who was present. The choir chamber itself was examined again. Sound engineers brought in to test its acoustics discovered something bizarre. At certain frequencies, particularly those matching the pitch of the 13th voice, the room produced a standing wave in the shape of a torus, a self-contained loop of sound, not outward reverberation but inward collapse, as if the room had been built to catch something, or contain it. The floor beneath the central lectern had been replaced in the late 1940s after a minor structural collapse, but no one had ever explored what lay beneath it. The record simply said filled and sealed. When police removed the panel, they found a void nearly 3 feet deep beneath the choir floor, and in that cavity, embedded into the concrete, was an iron disc. 12 inches wide, featureless, cold to the touch. It was magnetically inert, but it hummed. Not audibly, but unmistakably. Those who touched it described a vibration in their teeth, a headache that faded only after they stepped outside the chapel. One technician collapsed while taking thermal readings. When revived, he whispered, "The song is not finished." The disc was left in place. No one could explain its function. It had no inscription, no tool marks, as though it had always been there. But when the 13th tape was played in the room, something extraordinary happened. The pitch of the hidden disc shifted, slightly, ever so slightly, matching the sustained note of the unknown voice. And just for a moment the stone walls themselves seemed to respond. A pulse, a resonance, as if the convent were not a building, but a bell waiting to be rung. After that, the tape was sealed in diocesan archives under the authority of Cardinal Mulgrave, who ordered all copies destroyed. But one fragment, just 15 seconds, leaked online years later. It was quickly scrubbed, yet those who heard it described the same feeling. Not fear, not wonder, but longing, as if something once lost was calling them back, not to a place but to a sound. A note without breath, a harmony that had no origin. And if the 13th voice did not belong to any of the nuns, then it must have been waiting for someone to teach it a song. The garden was not marked on any modern maps of St. Ethel's. Tucked behind the crumbling south cloister wall, overgrown with hedgerow and thistle, it had vanished from view and memory sometime after the 1970s. But Sister Annalisa remembered it. She called it the quiet corner, where the air hung different and the birds would not sing. Detective Claymore, following a decades-old, hand-drawn convent schematic, discovered in an old maintenance file, noticed an irregularity, an area labeled Ordo Quadrantis, sealed 1954. The Latin was peculiar. Order of the Quadrant, a name not associated with any official monastic term. Using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, the garden re-emerged. A small walled enclosure, roughly circular, but with an oddly squared entrance, like a compass drawn wrong. Investigators cut their way through the overgrowth and breached the rusted iron gate, revealing a strange geometry of paths beneath the ivy. 4 gravel walkways split the space into quarters, meeting at a central stone altar, a plain, weather-worn monolith no taller than a child. Embedded in the stone was a shallow depression, about the size of a human skull. Documented fact: diocesan records show that in 1893, a group of Carmelite nuns at St. Ethel's attempted to establish a vigil garden, meant for nocturnal meditation. But after 3 sisters reported visions of luminous bodies rising from the soil, the area was declared inaccessible after sundown. One letter from the Mother Superior at the time refers cryptically to singing roots and the pull of inversion. Claymore took soil samples. They were like nothing she'd seen. The upper 6 inches were typical of Norfolk countryside, but deeper layers were off, too dark, too dense, laced with fine, hair-like filaments resembling fungal mycelium, but metallic under magnification. When exposed to high-frequency sound, the filaments moved. Bizarre detail. Geologists from the University of Kent confirmed that the garden's soil contained an abnormally high concentration of magnetite and rare silicates. The kind you'd expect to find near a meteorite impact, they said. Except there was no record of any such event in the area, ever. Unresolved question: why was the Order of the Quadrant formed? And what did they believe they were guarding or awakening beneath that garden? A small niche in the wall near the altar contained a sealed iron box. Inside, wrapped in cloth that had long since fossilized, was a short manuscript, bound in red leather and labeled simply, Psalter of the Hollow Tongue. Written in a blend of Latin, Old English, and a cipher yet to be decoded. The Psalter includes a litany of verses, structured like prayers but lacking the grammar of address. They do not speak to anything. They speak with something, as if responding to a previous message. Dr. Linnea North, brought in again, translated part of one verse. We buried the mouth and marked the sky. The voice was too early, the clock was too late. Its eye is the root, its breath is the seed. So we walk, so we hum, so it sleeps. The text referred repeatedly to a place called the Below One. Not hell, not the underworld, but something adjacent. A term without mythological precedent. And yet, references to the Below One appeared again in a most unexpected place. A letter from Sister Joan, sent 2 weeks before the disappearance to a Benedictine monk in Milan. The garden sings, she wrote, but only when one stands still. We have tested it. It is not madness, Brother Emilio. It is remembrance. I believe the Below One is not a thing, but a hole in memory, buried in soil and song. The choir is close to unlocking it. After the discovery, Claymore began cross-referencing early maps of the convent. One, dated 1661, showed a herbalum, a herb garden, in the same location. Marginal notes in faded ink stated, avoid planting root deep, the lattice must remain. A lattice. She returned with ground radar. Beneath the stone altar was more than earth. 40 feet below ground was a perfect cube-shaped chamber, 5 meters on each side, lined with regular striations, not natural, not hewn, formed. A cavity, sealed, but it wasn't empty. A single object sat inside, visible only through resonance imaging, a cone-shaped sculpture 6 feet tall, with 12 radial arms extending from its core. 12. The same number as the ritual points in the cellar. The same number as the voices in the choir. The same number as the compass directions etched faintly into the garden gate. A private memo from Dr. Helen Murnane speculated the object was not a sculpture, but an instrument. A kind of tuning fork, not for sound, but for space. She proposed a theory so radical it was dismissed outright by the church. St. Ethel's may have been built atop an ancient harmonic lens, a place not of worship, but of containment. The rituals, the hymns, the sacred geometry, they weren't meant to invite heaven. They were meant to suppress something beneath. Villagers, too, had their stories. An old man named Julian Brackley, near blind, claimed that when he was a boy, the nuns forbade children from walking behind the convent after sunset. Said the garden glowed if you watched too long, said it could trick your feet, make you walk a path that wasn't there. He recounted a tale told to him by his grandmother, who once served at the convent as a laundress, that the garden was older than the building itself, that when the stones were laid in 1452, the builders found something underground, a mouth made of iron, and that the first abbess, terrified, planted vines to keep it from ever waking. That year, the year of the convent's founding, coincides with a mysterious entry in the Vatican's private almanac, referencing an unnamed abbey in East Anglia where the stones sang wrongly, and a choir was reshaped by its echo. The manuscript's entry ends with a single sentence. The mouth is closed. Let no key be shaped from song, but someone had shaped a key. 12 voices, one unknown, a harmony designed not for praise but for piercing, and the garden, the forgotten quadrant, had waited in silence until the notes found their way back into soil. When Detective Claymore returned to St. Ethel's in mid-November, the garden had changed. Not visibly. The stones still slept beneath their mossy covering, and the hedges still leaned inward as though wind warped. But the air was different, hollow, the kind of silence that didn't rest on the ears, but rather seemed to breathe in through them. 2 field technicians refused to re-enter the enclosure after spending time there. One reported intense vertigo. The other described a sensation as if the world stopped moving, but I hadn't. Even more unnerving was the birds. For weeks now, none flew over the convent's southern quarter. Their migration paths had bent subtly around it, noticeable only when plotted en masse. Documented fact. In December 1993, an atmospheric anomaly was recorded over Norfolk by the British Geological Survey. It appeared as a standing wave, measured in infralow sound. Frequencies lasting precisely 7 minutes. The epicenter, St. Ethel's. No weather disturbance, no seismic event, just a sonic shadow that passed, then vanished. Claymore pressed further into the convent's records, this time combing diocesan archives in Norwich. She uncovered correspondence between Sister Joan and a reclusive Benedictine scholar, Factor Thassalus, a known student of heretical cosmologies. Much of it was redacted, but one paragraph escaped the censor's pen. The choir must stop before Advent. The frequencies are close. The inner mouth stirs when they sing the third chord with the open throat. If they pass from dissonance to unity, God help them. Or don't, for unity is not always a blessing. Bizarre detail. A liturgical hymnal used at St. Ethel's was discovered to contain notations not in any known musical system, drawn in concentric circles, with vowel shapes in the margins. Acousticians determined these symbols, approximated resonant intervals found in certain underground chambers known to cause auditory hallucinations. It was music written not for ears but for stones. This hymnal had been tucked beneath the floorboards in the east. Transept, sealed inside a carved wooden box with a phrase inscribed in Latin, resonare non in or humanum, to resound not in the mouth of man. Claymore played the 13th tape again in her car, unable to resist its pull. As she listened, the world dimmed, not darker, just thinner, as though light had been stretched too far. She felt, though she could not say why, that the 13th voice was no longer on the tape. It was around her. That night she dreamed of St. Ethel's. In her vision, the choir was not made of women, but of mannequins, ceramic and hollow-eyed, posed in mid-note. The The air shimmered around them like heat off a desert floor, and from beneath the floorboards rose the sound of rushing breath. She awoke to find her ears bleeding, and she was not alone. 3 archivists who'd handled Sister Joan's remaining journals reported nightmares of humming metal mouths, gardens without sky, and clocks that melted into pitch. One, a lapsed seminarian, woke sobbing, repeating the words, "We are not the first echo." Unresolved question. If something was returning through St. Ethel's, had it left to begin with? Or had it always been there, waiting for the pitch, the key, the shape of silence that would open it again? In early 1994, without official explanation, the Vatican issued a sealed decree known only to high ecclesiastical offices. Resonantia clausa, resonance closed. No formal release ever followed, but whisper networks among certain theological orders speculated. It was linked to 3 known sites: a ruined monastery in Crete, a submerged abbey off the coast of Brittany, and St. Ethel's. All 3 shared one obscure trait. They were built on sites where ancient, pre-Christian songs had once been performed, not in celebration, but in containment. Dr. Helen Murnane became increasingly convinced that the concept of song, as used at St. Ethel's, did not refer to worship. It referred to architecture, not of stone but of resonance, a lattice of tone designed to hold something down, or in. She proposed that what the nuns had been taught to sing was not sacred harmony, but a kind of sonic lock, a prison built of notes, only sustained so long as no other voice joined it. When the 13th voice entered, the lock was changed, or broken. The return of silence in the garden, then, was not peace. It was containment failure. One final entry in Sister Imelda's recovered journal read, "The humming has stopped. We no longer sing. The silence is wrong. Not empty. Listening. We feel her beneath the altar. Not sleeping. Waiting to hear if the key is turned." Sister Imelda was last seen standing near the garden wall, holding a small wooden tuning fork. No one saw her walk away. She was simply no longer there when the bell rang for morning meal. The fork was later found stuck upright in the soil, as though planted. Its pitch matched the 13th voice. Claymore made the decision to close the case, officially in March 1994. Insufficient evidence. The report read, "Circumstances unknown, case closed." But in a personal letter, never mailed, she confessed, "We're not meant to understand what happened at St. Ethel's, not in words. The truth there is tonal, something sung once, and maybe again. I keep thinking of Sister Joan, her choir, how music can remember what people forget. Maybe they didn't disappear. Maybe they were remembered somewhere else." In the years since, strange occurrences have been quietly noted around the site: instruments refusing to stay in tune, radios picking up fragments of polyphonic chant in static, hikers reporting soundless zones along the southern path. The land is not empty. It's resonating. Something beneath St. Ethel's has stopped sleeping, not rising, not speaking, but listening for the key again. Of all the records recovered in the wake of St. Ethel's vanishing, none were more unsettling than the so-called Gabriel transcripts. Found in a sealed envelope labeled "Not for Diocesan Filing." The pages bore the signature of Father Lawrence Gabriel, a Jesuit psychologist assigned in 1992 to assess the mental state of several choir members, following reports of chant-induced fugue. His visit had never been formally documented. His presence known only through this buried set of notes. Documented fact: Father Gabriel had been involved with previous assessments of cloistered communities. During ritual reformation efforts in the 1970s, he was regarded as sensitive to esoteric manifestations of psychological distress. But what he recorded at St. Ethel's went beyond clinical notation. His entries began with unease. They sing with perfect intonation, yet none can read music. One claims she dreams of notes, another hears them from the walls. Their unity is not skill, it's surrender. Something has taught them this. Over several sessions, he spoke with 4 of the nuns individually: Sister Teresa, Sister Colette, Sister Agnes, and finally, Sister Joan herself. Each woman repeated similar refrains: that the music was not learned, but arrived; that it existed already in the stone; that the songs wanted out, not to be performed, but reclaimed. Sister Colette, who suffered from aphasia outside of the choir loft, described a black garden in her sleep. "The dirt is soft," she whispered. You can press your ear to it. You hear her sighing. Bizarre detail. In one transcript, Sister Agnes repeated the same phrase exactly, 128 times in a row, her voice rising in precise half-tone increments. We are the measure. We are the mouth. Father Gabriel noted that she appeared entranced. But when the chant ended, she had no memory of speaking. And then Sister Joan. Their interview was short, 20 minutes. But its content left Gabriel shaken. She did not look at him when she spoke. She faced the wall. And she spoke in thirds. Not third person, in thirds. Her sentences came out as triplets, rhythmic, Trinitarian, spoken as though accompanied by two invisible speakers whose voices were simply not being heard. I am one. I echo two. The third has not yet breathed. We are not sisters. We are strings. The silence beneath is not the absence of God. It is what came before speech. Gabriel's final entry, dated just days before the disappearance, reads, "This is not a convent. It is a tuning chamber, a vault of echo and ritual. These women are not insane. They are in sync. The hymns they sing predate scripture, predate even language. What they channel is neither possession nor revelation. It is resonance, pure, subterranean. And something has begun to answer. Unresolved question, was Father Gabriel's presence at the convent part of an effort to understand the phenomenon, or suppress it? A side note in the margin of the final page suggests he was instructed to classify any non-standard liturgical expressions as localized ecstatic disorder. But his final lines betray no confidence in such framing. This is not disorder. It is structure, deep and patient. I do not believe the sisters are lost. I believe they have stepped into the space between notes. What that space truly meant became clearer when Claymore, in her last act before transferring out of Norfolk, requested the tapes be sonically analyzed by the Defense Acoustic Research Facility. Officially, no reply was issued, but an anonymous internal memo was later leaked online by an unverified source. It described what researchers found on the 13th tape: a tonal modulation below the audible choir, a subharmonic waveform that fluctuated in 12 repeating intervals. On spectral analysis, it formed a perfect toroidal spiral, a sound shape theorized in quantum harmonic models, but never naturally recorded. What truly terrified the team was not its presence. It was the whisper embedded inside, slowed down 4,000%. The waveform revealed an audio artifact, 6 syllables spoken in a voice that bore no spectral match to any human sample. The phrase, barely translated, was rendered as, "Bring the whole back through." Not bring us back. Not open the way. Bring the whole back through. The implication was staggering. That the choir had not summoned something forward. They had prepared something's return. A reversal. A re-entry. And St. Ethel's was the echo chamber. Even more unnerving was a note scribbled by a junior researcher in the margins of the waveform printout. If this is a voice, it's not speaking to us. It's speaking from behind us. Claymore could not sleep for days after reading that. Villagers near the ruins of St. Ethel's began reporting strange phenomena that spring. Shadows cast where no sun reached. Faint sounds like chimes in airless rooms. A dull hum in their teeth when standing too near the south wall. Some claimed to hear footsteps at night, soft, measured, in groups of 12. But no prints were ever found. One evening, a retired groundskeeper named Wallace caught sight of something in the convent garden, a figure not moving, but vibrating. A tall silhouette, faint as breath on glass, standing at the center of the old altar path. He turned to get his binoculars. When he looked again, there were 12 of them, and they were facing outward. The phenomenon lasted 12 seconds. Then they blinked out as if the garden had exhaled. By the time researchers returned, the earth had shifted. The altar stone was no longer there, not moved, not stolen, gone, replaced by a depression shaped exactly like the one found beneath it. An empty socket, a mouth, waiting for its key. By early 1995, the ruins of St. Ethel's were sealed. Not officially. No government ordinance was passed, no signposts erected. But the path that led to the convent was allowed to overgrow. The old access road was reclassified as private land. Quietly, without declaration, the site vanished from local maps. Yet something remained. Dr. Helen Maine, unshaken in her obsession, conducted one final set of readings that January. She and 2 colleagues snuck onto the grounds, under cover of darkness with geophones and ground-penetrating radar. What they recorded would never be published. Only fragments of her report survive, salvaged from a corrupted hard drive a decade later. Documented fact. On the night of January 19, 1995, 3 separate frequency spikes were detected beneath St. Ethel's garden. The signal resembled low-frequency choir bursts, tonal pulses consistent with synchronized human breath. But from a depth of 18 meters underground, there were no tunnels, no caves, just solid soil. The pulses repeated every 12.4 minutes, precisely, and beneath each pulse was a pause. Not silence, but negative pressure. A withdrawal of sound, as though the earth itself was listening back. One of the assistants, a technician named Ruth, suffered a seizure during the 3rd pulse. Her final coherent statement, before losing consciousness, was recorded on the equipment's open mic. "They're not gone. They're in the breath between." That phrase, the breath between, would resurface weeks later, etched into the wall of Claymore's old office by an unknown hand. The handwriting did not match any known employee. More disturbingly, it matched a line from one of the Gregorian sequences used at St. Ethel's. Thought lost to time. Spiritus inter notus, the spirit between notes. Bizarre detail. A former bishop, now defrocked, claimed that St. Ethel's was built atop an ancient, druidic site known as the mouth of the earth. In a letter he sent, later leaked by anonymous clerical sources, he warned of the resurgence of vocal vaults, places designed not to elevate prayer, but to bind voices together into containment songs. He wrote, "They did not pray to heaven, these builders. They sang downward, to bury things in resonance. They believed that the earth would hold only if reminded constantly. What not to remember? St. Ethel's had not been the first choir. It had been the last." Unresolved question. What, if anything, lies beneath St. Ethel's now? Has the song ended? Or has it simply shifted frequencies, moved from the physical to the psychoacoustic, infecting memory, language, even architecture? Reports continued. A family living 5 miles from the site claimed that every night at 2:33 a.m., their dog would whimper and hide. For 12 minutes the air would feel heavy in the house, then vanish. A cyclist reported seeing figures in the woods, cloaked in gray, moving in single file with heads bowed. He said they sounded like rustling hymnals. One disturbing video, circulated briefly before deletion, showed a group of amateur urban explorers descending into the ruined chapel. As they approached the altar stone depression, the sound cut out. What followed was 11 minutes of video showing them standing, still, utterly unmoving, before the feed died. None of the individuals could later recall what happened during that time. They did, however, each begin to stutter on the word 12. Attempts to excavate the site were quietly discouraged. Equipment would fail. Workers reported unshakable feelings of being watched. One wrote in his log, "It's not haunted. It's not even sacred. It's aware." The land itself had become part of the song. By mid-year, Dr. Maine disappeared. Her last known email, sent at 3:12 a.m., was to an unlisted recipient. It read, "I heard the 13th voice in a dream last night. It's not singing anymore. It's counting." The audio analysis team disbanded without public explanation. Internal memos were shredded. Father Gabriel's whereabouts remain unknown. Claymore, long since retired, was last seen near the northern fens, humming a melody that no one recognized. A local shopkeeper asked her what it was. She paused, smiled faintly, and said, "Not a song, just a reminder." She vanished 3 days later. But the garden at St. Ethel's never truly grew over. The weeds died, then failed to regrow. The soil refused roots, as if no plant dared anchor there. Wind would pass through, but no birds landed. The entire space became a kind of tonal vacuum, resistant to life but full of memory. One final development, hidden in an academic journal's back pages, may point to the deepest mystery of all. A team of researchers studying frequency and memory disorders published a case study of a woman found wandering near Norwich, speaking in a language no one recognized. Not Latin, not Greek, but tonal. She communicated in hums and rhythms, 12-tone, sequences that aligned with harmonic resonance patterns mapped to medieval stone cathedrals. Her DNA profile matched no one in any database, but her face bore a striking resemblance to Sister Joan. Not aged, not preserved, identical. She was placed in psychological care, where she now sits, humming endlessly, eyes closed, head tilted as if listening for something or someone that still sings beneath the soil. The final known piece of evidence tied to the mystery of St. Ethel's arrived not through an official channel, but through a librarian, Mary Duval, a quiet archivist at the Norfolk Diocesan Repository, had worked for nearly 30 years cataloging minor parish records. She was meticulous, invisible, easily overlooked. But in late 2004, while sorting uncategorized audio reels misfiled under Southeastern liturgies, she uncovered one labeled simply 30, not 13, third-throughs. The reel was dated April 1993, a full 2 weeks after the last confirmed sighting of the St. Ethel sisters. Duval alone listened to the contents. She would never speak again. Documented fact: Mary Duval was admitted to a care facility for catatonic mutism 3 days after discovering the reel. Her condition baffled neurologists. No trauma, no stroke, no physical cause. When shown a photograph of the tape, her pulse spiked. When asked if she could hum what she heard, she wept. The reel has since disappeared, but not before a backup copy, unlabeled, was sent to a university sound preservation lab in Glasgow. There, one technician, Reza Al-Hussein, digitized the content. He didn't believe the legends. He was a skeptic, practical, analytical, until he played it. The reel began not with music, but with breath. 12 staggered intakes, then silence, then what can only be described as tone, not melody, not harmony. A single note sustained, but not by one voice. It was layered, as though 12 vocal cords, trained beyond human possibility, maintained a single pitch for exactly 6 minutes. Then a 13th voice enters. Not above, not below, behind. It does not sing, it responds. It vibrates through the equipment, through the walls, through the bones. Bizarre detail. That voice, when analyzed, contained no consistent frequency. Instead, it formed a waveform that pulsed in a double helix, not synowave, not analog, but biological, as if the sound were alive. Al-Hussein deleted the file, but it would not stay gone. Every time he rebooted the system, the audio reappeared, titled only with the number 0. No metadata, no time code, just the loop. He destroyed the drive, changed jobs, moved to Morocco, but he still hears it, he says, in certain winds. In church bells that toll just past midnight, in silence that seems too arranged. Unresolved question. What was the purpose of the choir at St. Ethel's? To protect, to imprison, or to awaken? Claymore once speculated that the nuns were never taken, but absorbed. That their song had completed, and what it opened was not a door, but a memory. Something long forgotten by stone and earth alike. Other scholars posit the existence of sublinguistic sentience, consciousness not housed in flesh, but in resonance. That perhaps, long before man carved faith into cathedrals, something older carved itself into vibration, waiting. St. Ethel's, then, was not a home. It was a receiver, and the sisters, instruments, flesh tuned to ancient keys, voices shaped not by God but by echo. One chilling passage, found scrawled inside the convent's bell tower in what appeared to be blood, though tests returned inconclusive, reads, "She waits in the low note. She sings in dreams. Her hymn is the first forgetting." It remains a theological debate, one that no modern seminary will acknowledge. But folklore has picked up the thread. Locals tell their children not to hum near the ruins, not to whistle, not to chant, because sometimes, if the tones are aligned just right, the garden answers, and the breath beneath returns. Most of St. Ethel's has now crumbled. The bell tower collapsed in 2011. The garden is fenced but unguarded. Moss spreads where hymns once rose. But on certain nights when fog curls in just so, people say they still hear faint music, not echoing, rising, 12 notes. Then silence. Then the 13th. The garden remains empty but not quiet. The soil remembers. The wind does not sing, but it moves like breath, slow, deliberate, as if inhaling a memory too vast to voice aloud. Stones once meant to hold the sacred now sag inward, softened not by time but by listening. And if you stand long enough in the ruins, you might feel it, not sound but pressure, a hum behind your ribs, a shift behind the eyes, not fear, not comfort, but recognition. Some say St. Ethel's was a tragedy. Others say it was a warning. But what lingers most is not what was seen or even heard. It's what was unheard, the space between tones, between heartbeats. between what we know and what our bones still remember. We like to think of songs as human things, our creations. But the longer you linger in the breathless shadow of St. Ethel's, the more that comfort peels away. Maybe the first songs weren't ours. Maybe we are only echoes, finding rhythm in things that do not care to be understood. There is no final revelation, no rescued nun, no reopened case, only the hush after the hymn, the empty score, the garden listening. Still, always,